it's all about just out executing other people.
Yeah.
Don't waste your time over worrying about that sort of stuff. If you genuinely understand the idea, if you're carrying the flame, you
Yeah.
execute that flame into existence and nothing else will matter.
Welcome to the Deongligliato podcast, where I interview business people who run or have sold businesses worth a few $1 million all the way through to billions of dollars. While most of my time is spent managing investment portfolios for people after they've had a successful exit, I've always been fascinated by the entire process and hearing the insights that successful entrepreneurs and business people have learned along their journey. At Fortress Family Office, we're an investment portfolio manager and we manage portfolios for ultra high net worth families. If you'd like to know more about not only the way we approach investment markets, but our philosophy on life and business, feel free to subscribe to my weekly insights note. Go to www.fortressfamilyoffice.com and hit subscribe. In this episode, I interview Phil Morle, partner at Main Sequence Ventures. Phil is a prominent name in venture capital ecosystem and well known for co-founding Australia's first startup incubator, Pollenizer. From its foundation in 2008, Pollenizer went on to help hundreds of ideas turn into real businesses, including Spreets, which was founded and sold within 12 months for about $40 million. Throughout this episode, Phil discusses how he transitioned from high-paying big tech to risking everything and working himself into the VC space at a time when the startup ecosystem barely existed. Really inspiring to hear Phil's dedication to solving some of society's most difficult challenges with a focus on hard science. So if you enjoy the show, feel free to share it with family and friends and leave a review. Phil, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Brilliant to be here.
Excellent. Do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in business?
Yeah, so I am now in the venture capital business. I'm a partner at Main Sequence Ventures, where I help science-driven companies become globally significant businesses. But my journey to that point has been meandering, as is often the case with many entrepreneurial people, as we sort of try and find where we can deliver the most value. Oddly enough, I actually began my career as a theatre director, and you'll see as we sort of get into the conversation that oddly enough, I just keep coming back to that as being a critical starting point, because in theatre you have to make a lot with very little. And in essence, that's what I've done throughout my career. But I did that for 10 years. I made websites for people on the side, because theatre isn't famous for paying people well. And then I leapt into the sort of web development business as the internet caught fire in the 90s and the early 2000s, and sort of ended up being the head of a large startup called Kazaa, and I was the chief technology officer there. And that's where I kind of got my startup mojo, and really enjoyed that, sort of making new companies from scratch. And when I came out of that, there wasn't much of a startup ecosystem, believe it or not, here in Australia.
Yeah.
And so there were no other startups to go and work for. So I scratched my own itch, and I co-founded a organization called Pollenizer, which was Australia's first sort of startup incubator.
What year was this roughly, Phil?
2008.
2008.
And we did that for about 10 years. And at the end of that time, Pollenizer was helping the National Science Agency, CSIRO, to start to, help science teams commercialize what they're doing. And that's why I really, got infected with the bug of bringing together venture and entrepreneurship with what's in the labs and turning into these massively significant companies. And when Main Sequence came along, I had to join the mission. That's where I am now.
Yeah, okay. Did you always have that ambition to get into business, or was technology always really interesting to you, or is that something that just developed along the way?
I think it developed along the way. I have that U2 song, I still haven't found what I'm looking for.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
kind of, it's like life is a never-ending search for that, if you like, product market fit between me and the world. And so I like making something valuable. I like making it from scratch. I think that's the essence of what I do. And then I just throw that against different things throughout my career. And obviously I think doing that in business is a a melting pot for that, because you have to know how you're gonna make value, and you have to know how to measure that for yourself and know that that's happening. And so I've found myself in business. I've found a good fit there, especially around making new businesses. But it's an ever going. I'm a big believer in this idea of the infinite game. Like, there is no end. As soon as you can see
Yeah,
the end and some sort of final point, change the rules, keep going. Do something
yeah,
bigger.
yeah. So you've always been curious around what's going on in the world and creative by the sounds of it. As you go along into this sort of thing, you've been involved in lots of businesses from startup all the way through to exit. What's your biggest strength as you've gone along, and how does that help you sort of succeed?
I think my comfy spot, the place where I'm happiest, the place where I'm most comfortable, is when there's literally nothing in front of me other than an opportunity. In theater, we used to have this whole idea of the empty space, and you've just got some people, a couple of chairs and an empty space. How are you going to create a world in
Yeah,
front of you? And for many people, that's kind of petrifying, but for me, that is wonder. That's where I like to be. And so, in terms of my product market fit with business, this is where I can most help, because I can sort of tactically get things going and get them to a point of materiality and traction
yeah,
very, very quickly. And so that's where I focus. Another way of answering the question is, people often ask me, what do you do when you're a venture capitalist? And I say, well, it's much more like being a movie producer than it is being a banker. Yeah, there's
right.
so
Yeah,
much more to it than, cutting a check and saying, good luck, send me a bigger check back at some point in the next 10 years. It's really, it's building the talent that's required for the company, knowing how it's going to tell its story, knowing who it's going to work with. It's an enormous list of things, including the capital. And so that whole production mindset is something that I think I'm pretty good at, and something that I enjoy contributing to new businesses.
and does that influence the timeline where you get involved with companies? Does that put you earlier on in the company's
Yeah.
timeline because of your
Yeah.
your
I think,
interests and your strengths?
yeah, I think so. I mean, Main Sequence itself was founded to be an intervention at the very early stages so that companies can
Yeah,
really get to escape velocity out of the labs. My particular focus is the earlier the better. There's nothing I
yeah.
enjoy more than, speaking to a couple of scientists inside a lab who are saying, I wonder if there's a company here. Like, that's where I love
Okay. Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
begin. And then the job in venture is how to get that to escape velocity as soon as possible. We have a 10-year time cycle, timeline with venture capital.
yeah,
And so we really have to think about, we can't, sit on our hands. We have to get things to a point of traction as quickly as we can.
yeah. And in terms of that commercialization, that, talking about, a couple of scientists have got some sort of technology or something that they're working on it. Do you find that scientists have are they natural entrepreneurs? I assume they're probably. Do you find that
Mm.
there's people there that have got commercializable, if that's the word, technology that don't realize what they potentially are sitting on?
So some of them are just born entrepreneurs,
Yeah,
and
right.
some
Yeah,
of them don't want to be an entrepreneur. There's a common set of attributes, I think, which bond the two ideas. So both scientists and entrepreneurs, they're doing what they're doing because they want to have some meaningful impact on the world. They want to make something that's unique and brand new and valuable. And they're also very curious people. They tend not to be people that just want to work with something that already exists. They want to go and
Yeah.
find something new and then bring it to life. So that sort of bonds the two. And then it's really about, how do you build capability around that science? And that could be building it into the person. So allowing their inner entrepreneur to
Yep.
rip and kind of and become powerful, or it's building the rest of the team around them so that they can carry on being incredible at the science, but the commercial
Yep.
engine grows around them.
And by way of background for listeners, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the sorts of technology and the sorts of the space that you're in that you're most interested in?
Yeah, for sure. So main sequence operates right across the scientific spectrum. So but everything we invest in has got some difficult science at the core of the
Yep.
company. So for example, we have a company called Gilmore Space who are creating rockets to launch low Earth orbit satellites. We've got an infinite plastic recycling company. We have companies that are making new kinds of food without animals. We've got Asia's biggest plant-based meat company, V2 Food. So it's kind of
Yep.
that what's bonding these things together is, the world has a series of problems, if you like, that it needs to solve for so that humanity can continue to prosper. Yeah, technology can solve some of these problems, and then our job is to sort of bring those things to market as fast as possible so that they're answering the call of what we need on the planet. But it's deep, hard science,
Yeah.
and then building the companies around that.
Yeah. So this is not the next social media app. This is serious problems that need to be solved for the future of civilization, right?
That's right. That's right. That's where
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
that's our comfort zone. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And in terms of weaknesses as you go along, what's your biggest weakness, and how did you overcome that as you've gone along? Not just now, but sort of in your earlier days as you sort of go through that business journey.
Yeah. I think these are always interesting and difficult to think about, aren't they? Because I think everybody's weakness is probably also their strength as well, or
Hmm.
vice versa.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
in my case, because of the nature of my work and my personality, I spin up lots of plates. And so I always used to have a big discussion with my co-founder at Pollenizer, Mick Lubinskas, who, he's
Yep.
known as Mr. Focus.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually just focus on one thing and just do it fantastically well. I am not that guy. I have 25 plates spinning,
Right.
and it's a weakness. It's a strength as well because it gets things happening.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But it's a weakness because I'm just diluted across all 25 plates, and I'm worried about one of the plates falling off.
Right.
I think similarly, the because I get stuff done. Yeah, often the way of getting things done is just freaking doing it, and
Yeah.
but that makes me a bit of a control freak and not very good at delegating, and so makes it difficult to scale myself. So that those two things, I have to constantly go, where is that property of myself too much of a weakness right now? And where do I just need to tolerate that because it's delivering the value it needs to deliver?
You're saying you've got lack of focus, maybe, but is diverse focus is probably the better way to say it. Versus Mick, who's Mr. Focus. Is that where them being co-founders in that business, was that such a complementary thing? Is why things are so successful when you
Yeah,
get those complementary skill sets? Yeah. Okay.
without a doubt. And I think that's the trick, isn't it? As we build our businesses and our work in general, it's who are the people around us and how do we complement each other? I think one of the questions I ask myself a lot is, is the right person doing this work? And so I
Yeah.
may have started something up, and then I'm thinking, okay, well, because I've got the other 24 plates spinning, and this is sort of new to me. this work isn't happening in the best way because this other person should be doing it. And it's sort of being mindful of that and giving it to somebody that you know who's already there to do it, and I should stop being such a control freak. Or
Yeah.
it's actually saying there's enough of these things happening now. I need to hire somebody, bring them in, and start scaling that part of the work that needs to be done.
What's the catalyst for that, Phil? When you get to that point where you realize that that needs to go on to the next phase or to the next person to run with it, you've done the part that you do best. What is there a certain point in time where you realize it, or is it different for every single sort of company?
I think it for me, it's part of my weekly habit. So I have a sort
Yeah.
of journaling habit, and in that I ask myself that question every week. You know,
Okay.
what what are you working on that somebody else should be working on? That literally,
Yeah. Right.
it
Yep.
just forces me
Yep.
to answer that question. And I have to do it that way because otherwise I get into my own obsessed little world, just executing on my own.
Yeah.
I have to force myself out and then look at it differently.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. And you do that on a weekly basis. Ask yourself that question.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Otherwise,
Okay.
I just get lost. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And as you've gone through that process in seeing different businesses and invested in different businesses or been part of growing businesses, what would you call the best decision you've ever made, and why would that be, or one of the best decisions?
I think it was definitely starting Pollenizer with Mick.
Yep.
At the time, I had a choice of joining a very large global company as a chief technology officer, getting paid well, going around the world, but working for somebody else, or figuring out what this opportunity was with Pollenizer to be a company builder and venture studio with no money, but our own
Yeah.
destiny in the palm of our hands. And that was the leap that was made. And with the benefit of hindsight, that turned out to be good timing because, of course, the whole startup ecosystem, as we refer to it today, was
Yeah.
just beginning to take a life of its own. And
Yeah.
and so timing wise, that was really good. So in terms of, you know, if we measure life by a kind of treasure chest of learnings that we accrue that become useful to give value back to the world, Pollenizer is where my treasure chest filled up with the most
Yeah. Okay.
goodies, and and has really sort of set me up to be doing all the things that I love doing today, and hopefully people find valuable. So glad I've made that move.
What was one of the more memorable sort of moments being as part of that pollinizer journey? Is there anything that comes to mind as sort of particular achievements you're proud of, or companies that were
Mm.
most interesting, or that type of thing? Was there anything that you've got there that would be interesting?
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably the biggest sort of defining moment of Pollenizer and this whole idea of building a company from scratch is manifest in a company called Spreets, which I think we were best
Yep.
known for. And
Yep.
that company began with a, conversation at a Christmas party at Pollenizer with Dean McAvoy, who was the CEO of that company, and ended 1 year later when we sold the company for $40 million to Yahoo.
Yeah. Right.
And so
Yeah.
from zero to the 40 million in 12 months.
Incredible.
And it was, it was a defining moment for Pollenize. Interestingly, I had some important feedback as well on that. Someone said to me, that was one of the worst things that has happened to the startup ecosystem in Australia, because what it did for some large companies was tell the story that actually it can be quite normal to start a company and make $40 million of value in a year.
Right.
And so what was happening is startups, for a few years after that, startups would start working with a big benefactor of some kind, a big media company or a big retailer or an airline or something.
Yeah.
And the airline would, and the big company would say, well, it's been a year. Like, what's happening?
Oh, why haven't we had an exit? Right. Okay. Why haven't we got to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it just created unrealistic
Uh,
expectations from a corporate level or from the startup
that,
level?
that from the corporate level, I think,
Yeah,
and
okay.
it meant corporates were wanting too much certainty rather than saying there's an opportunity in the startups, but to do it, I have to understand the risk and be comfortable with
Yeah.
with things not being certain. And so that wasn't sort of super helpful. And I think we just have to recognize that Spreets, I like to think it's because we worked very hard and we did the right things, but also timing was absolutely a
Mhm.
factor. And this is always the case in the world of startups.
Yeah. Okay. That is interesting. And you wouldn't have thought that you'd have that, well, not negative feedback, but it's interesting feedback, that's for sure. You would have, I
Yeah,
would have only seen positives in that because it also would have
yeah, that's
inspired
right.
many entrepreneurs, right? Like the aspiring people or people who were doing
Definitely.
work suddenly could see, oh, hang on, I could do that. Whether they do or don't, whether it takes them 5 or 10 years to achieve that, suddenly they can see, okay, this stuff's real. And I
That's
do
right.
remember
Yeah.
that. And it was a lot of excitement around that, sort of the idea of that at the time, because that was, if you're talking back from when you guys started, 2008, that was really the early stages of the tech scene. That, a lot's happened in
It
the
was.
last 15 years, right? It's incredible to see the changes.
I think that's right. And I often remind people because we complain a lot as a startup ecosystem,
Mm,
right? And often when we're interviewed by the media about some government intervention or some funding or things like that, the question that's asked is done in a way that it's like, what's wrong with this? Like, why is this not working? And it's very easy to complain, but I think as someone that's been kicking around this community, since the early 2000s, it's, as you say, phenomenal what's happened. I mean, when I think back to in venture capital, for example, when we started Pollenizer, the entire pool of venture capital in Australia across all firms was smaller than Main Sequence's fund today.
yeah, yeah,
And of course, today in the news, we've seen Blackbird as a single fund has just raised
yeah.
$1 billion into its latest fund. So in terms of
Which
funding,
15 years
really,
ago, that was unimaginable, right? That was
yeah, that's right.
because back then you had people trying to raise those ESVCLP type funds and trying to get to the minimum of 10 mil. And that was a challenge for a lot of people
That's right.
because people would look at the venture capital stuff and say, oh, yeah, people did that 10 years ago and didn't work. It's going to happen like that again. There was that sort of a very
That,
different feel to it now than what there was back then. That the narrative around it was different. Now everyone wants to be
mm,
involved in tech because they've seen some of the success stories. And I guess you've also got that generational leap where you've had founders exit who are now reinvesting or coming back into funds and different ventures as ex-founders who have money. And that's probably a big difference compared to what you had 15, 20 years ago, I guess.
that's it. I think there's just generational layers of value here, and the end result is there's more money. The people that are making these products are better at doing it,
Yeah.
so the successes are better, and this sort of whole virtuous cycle is
Yeah.
kicking in.
And in terms of mistakes and challenges that you faced along the way, is there anything that's particularly notable that you could share?
Yeah, I think actually before I started Pollenizer with Mick, I joined another startup which shall remain nameless, but it was a bit of a disaster, and I had too much faith in a founder that was winging it too much, and sort of ended
Yeah.
up spending about a year in a company that didn't pay me, and I was spending a fortune on just covering my own bills and just waiting for the alleged funding to come in from
Yeah,
Silicon
right.
Valley, which it never did. Yeah, it's classic story.
Yeah.
So worth sharing, because I think it's worth saying, that we all fall for these things from time to time. And
Yeah.
but what was interesting about it is, that was in between the two. the experience of being the chief technology officer at Kazaa, where I was kind of well paid and, really felt like, I felt the situation that many people feel themselves in, which is I couldn't live off $1 less than I currently earn in my job to
Yeah.
keep my standard of
Yeah.
living. And I was there. And then, I went to the bottom of the valley of despair after a year, where I'd literally earned
Yeah.
nothing, spent all this money, I was
Yeah.
in a hole. And then I thought to myself, well, but look, life's fine. You're you're
Yeah.
actually, you're not poverty stricken. The family's fine. You've gone back a little
Yeah.
bit, you can bring it all back. And I thought, if I'm gonna start my own company, now's the moment. I mean, it caused me to commit to Pollenizer as the way, just thinking, well, the only way is up from here.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
and and it turned into a positive. But yeah, let's just say, before joining other people's organizations, I'm very clear on what the runway looks like and how much money is in the bank these
Yeah.
days.
Does that still happen to people who sort of join companies and don't give enough consideration to the quality of the people there, or they get sort of caught up in the vision and the story rather than looking at, like you say, the runway and what the substance behind it is? I imagine that is something that can still easily happen.
I think, yeah, I mean, hopefully, I mean, one thing to say is that in general these days, people joining startups are asked less to, put up with
Yeah.
ridiculous salaries in order to go for the big dream. But I think it does happen that, and it's a difficult balance, right? Because it's difficult for someone in my position, because I think it's important that founders can mobilize talent to back a vision and get involved for reasons other than money, and be part of the team that will remove the risk of a company that may ultimately sort of employ you into the future. But certainly it's I mean, it's about honesty, I think, isn't it? Honesty,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
transparency, have a proper conversation. And I think I'll always be, if someone said to me today in a new opportunity, look, there's only 6 months worth of money, but here's the job and here's how I think you can help. It's like, great, well, let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go for 6 months, and let's extend that runway together. Yeah.
What was the best advice you've ever been given along the way? There must have been some really interesting stuff you've heard and seen.
Yeah. I think, I suppose I've got a couple to talk about here. One is incredibly simple but important in terms of what I do today. So when I actually partially did a PhD in my early,
Yeah.
this is all part of my, still haven't found what I'm looking for, kind of looking around
Yeah. Yeah.
for what I want to do. And whilst I was doing it, I felt that there was a moment where I felt like someone had stolen my IP. I felt like there
Okay.
was a moment where another researcher had taken what I was doing and presented it as their own. And I went to the person that was heading up the technology transfer office, who subsequently became a very good friend, actually. And I said, "This is what's happening. This is outrageous. What are we going to do about this?" And he just said, "Look, this sort of stuff happens all the time. Where does one person's idea begin and another person's idea end? And it's all about just out executing other people.
Yeah.
Don't waste your time over worrying about that sort of stuff. If you genuinely understand the idea, if you're carrying the flame, you
Yeah.
execute that flame into existence and nothing else will matter." And that was a really confronting challenge to me, but it is actually defining in terms of everything that I
Yeah.
do now. And then the second one is actually just from a book, and it's from Simon Sinek's idea of the
Yeah.
infinite game that I mentioned earlier, which is just transformational for me, especially in business, right? Where in business we do tend to collapse everything into the sort of win-loss kind of play the game to win kind of dynamic,
Yeah.
rather than play the game to play the game and figure out how to keep playing the game and make the game richer and more interesting and bigger over time. And so, we talked about the journal with the sort of weekly prompt of, it should somebody
Yeah.
else be doing this work. That's a daily prompt for me. It's like play the infinite
Yeah. Okay.
game and kind of, are you doing it? Because it's very human to go, hang on a minute, I want to win, rather than
And
hang
that
on, how do
changes
we
your
make this
mindset too,
bigger?
right? But
Yeah.
this makes it a a long game, and you're thinking differently when you're thinking along those lines versus almost a zero sum game or a winning now, when it's like I'm doing this forever in
Yeah.
different ways, whatever it might be. And how does that evolve? And how do I do that to make it sustainable and to be there for the long term?
And it
Total mindset shift.
only gets better. This is the sort of super interesting thing. Like we're doing some work in our portfolio at the moment around helping large scale manufacturing of some of the biology based companies come to life. We're having regular meetings with all of our companies and their competitors
Yeah.
to say, how
All
do we
right.
do this? Because actually, there's nothing to compete on until the market
Yeah.
has risen, right? So we need to do that together, and
Yeah.
that just makes the
Interesting.
game much more interesting. And similarly, the CSIRO has an accelerator program for scientists called the On Accelerator program, which is just coming back to life at the moment. Obviously, it's our sort of sister program here at the CSIRO, but we're bringing in other venture capitalists as part of that. And
Yeah.
so on one hand, you go, well, gosh, we'll just make it harder for us to win
Yeah.
because, our competitors are in the room. But on the other
Yeah.
hand, a different perspective on the same thing is what we're doing is we're figuring out how to fund more startups better with the VCs that can help them the most, who have the best networks to actually
Yeah.
help them, which will make deal flow for us to invest in, which is stronger next, because we can't fund
Yeah.
everything. And so everyone ends up winning, but you just have to step out of this sort of control spot where you kind of own it and you're in complete control, but everything's small. You may win, but you're winning a small game.
Yeah. You're creating a bigger pie to start with,
Yeah,
right? This is
exactly.
how you create
Yeah,
the bigger pie to
yeah,
start.
that's right. That's
Yes,
right.
that's really interesting. And in terms of business people that you've seen, either in Australia that you know or just from afar, who are the people that
Yeah,
inspire you the most?
I think there's probably the usual suspects are going to come up here, but I think it's people that have the audacity to feel like they can do something enormous, like something
Yep.
global scale, something nation scale. And I think, in Australia, I'd have to say Mike Cannon Brooks,
Yeah.
who, has, become a powerful, wealthy person who uses that as a force for good and global transformation every single day. And you see it in his actions every single day. And I've become a big believer in, what happens when you combine science with venturing sort of, ambition. And you see that in his work. He actually, he says we could be the biggest exporter of energy in this region, and then he builds it and he spends his own money
Yeah.
on it and brings in his influence to do it. You know, I I'm a massive fan of Elon Musk, the businessman, and I know he's a
Yeah.
controversial figure for some, but I just think you can't argue with what he's built. Literally,
Yeah.
a Apollo mission scale,
Yeah.
capabilities. And we all remember when everyone thought he was an idiot making overly ambitious claims, and each time
Yeah.
he actually comes back and he's done it. And so
Oh,
yep,
he's
action-based people.
yeah, he's the guy. If you had to point to somebody in terms of talking about executing, there's no one better at executing than him. I mean, in terms of
Yeah,
he's got the
yeah,
ideas, but anyone could have those ideas that he's got, but no one's been able to execute like he has. It's just incredible.
yeah.
Whatever you think of him,
I,
in terms of his ability to execute, is just astounding.
yeah, I think the two things are, conviction and execution, and actually
Mm,
doing both of those things and doing them unapologetically and thoroughly. And I think, the world needs people like that, because it's very easy to put something in the too hard biscuit,
yeah,
and I think just to risk not only capital, but also to risk reputation, I think is
yeah,
an often understated thing. But it's amazing. I mean, I put myself in this situation all the time, in situations where I'm doing something bold and reputationally risky, because if it doesn't come off, it's a bit embarrassing. But I know that fuels me more than anyone can pay me. So,
yeah, yeah.
you know,
Well, that comes back to that
I think,
conviction side, right?
yeah, that's right. That's
Yep,
right.
absolutely. What's the best business book that you've ever read? Have you got a couple of recommendations you could point us to?
Yeah, probably the most recent book that I'm loving is a book called The Power Law, and it's a
Yep.
book about it's a fairly recent book, and it's all about how venture capital works, and it's told through stories from the founding moments of Silicon Valley, when Fairchild Semiconductor was funded by this new breed of investors that started investing in a way that looks something like venture capital today. And then back then it was actually
Okay.
called adventure capital. And the point of it is you're taking substantial risks in the investment, but if it works, it's a big
Yeah.
return. And if anyone that wants to understand the business of venture capital through the stories that have grown over the last, half century, it's a fantastic book. And the
Called
other
Power
book I
Law,
think,
is it?
yeah, it's called The
Power,
Power Law. Yeah,
the
yeah.
Power Law. Okay.
And then another book that I'm reading right now isn't a business book, but I consider it my to-do list, and it's called How the
Okay.
World Really Works. And it's a book which lists, I suppose the takeout of the book is removing fossil fuels from our environment is really, really difficult to do. And
Right.
here's why.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not arguing to not do it, but it's saying here's what you have to do it.
Right.
And I've literally said that, it's got like a whole chapter on food production, for example, which I'm very obsessed with, and how to do that sustainably. And it just shows you
Yeah.
how much fossil
How
fuel is
ingrained it
used
is
to
it?
make a tomato. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Right.
but it's so beautifully sort of written that you go, okay, there's a company there, and there's a company there, and there's a company there,
Okay.
uh,
Yeah.
and and so that's why it's become my to-do list.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, well, we might have to put those in the notes on the podcast. Those couple of books.
Yeah, great.
Um,
Great.
that's good. What about quotes on business or life or anything like that? Have you got anything in particular that you've sort of got a favorite quote or something like that?
I think there's the famous Thomas Paine quote, and there's some other variations on this, but it's lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in this. Like I've been thinking a lot recently about the the sort of asking for permission type culture that we have in so many
Yeah.
of our companies, which, people sort of design into a company so that there's kind of control and discipline around what happens, but it makes things incredibly slow and risk averse rather than sort of getting things done. And I also think, and certainly we have this in venture, when we decide to fund something, we're very clear in our fund that it's okay for somebody to hate it. And we use the Jeff Bezos phrase, well, I disagree and commit, right?
Yeah.
So it's,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
but how many companies have the culture which is, if you disagree, argue for not doing it, right? But you have
Yeah.
enough people doing that, and kind of nothing happens your entire time. becomes just trying to get to the starting line on something. So I think
Yeah.
it's just really, it's just know where you sit on something. And I think in the end, there's very few things which you should get in the way of. Like if you disagree with it, say, look, I'm not going to
Yeah.
be involved because I don't really believe in it, but go for it. Yeah,
Yeah.
show me,
Yeah.
show me I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, we're all wrong at different times, right? We've all got those
That's
stories
right.
where we've been wrong and something hasn't turned. I mean, I've looked at different companies over the years, and I, and this is why I'm not in venture capital, because I could see companies and I look and go, well, that won't work because of this, and that won't work because of that. But I could put a line through every company, but some of them actually do work, and I just
Yeah,
didn't pick the particular founder who had the ability to solve that problem that I thought was probably a deal breaker. So we're all
yeah,
wrong with different things, and that's doesn't hurt to remind yourself of that from time to time, that we're not infallible, and like you say, lead, follow, or get out of the way. I like it.
that's
What's
right.
next,
Yeah.
Phil? In terms of for you and for main sequence, what's the future hold?
Well, I think I am very clear on my mission. As I mentioned earlier in this conversation, I now, have the audacity of thinking that the combination of science and venture can have an enormously positive impact on the world because we can invent hard things and then we can manifest them on a massive scale in the world. And boy, do we need that today. There's sort of lots to be done, especially around climate. So in terms of, problem vectors, climate's the big one. I'm looking for things to solve there and doing that every day. And then in terms of how and
Yeah,
sort of toolkits for doing that is very interested in, biology. I think we've got to a point in science where we now understand how many problems we have in the world are actually already solved by nature, by biology. And we
yeah,
need to go and find how nature's fixed it and then figure out how we scale that. And there's just an abundance of stuff to do there. Much of it replaces things like fossil fuels and and usually it involves carbon going back into the earth rather than carbon going up into
yeah,
the atmosphere. So I'm super excited by that, and can't imagine myself doing anything different for the next 10 years at least.
yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, Phil, thanks very much for your time. It's been
Thank you.
super interesting to hear about your journey, and we'll hope to have you on again in the not too distant future. Thanks for joining us,
Excellent. It's
Phil.
been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. Thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, we would really appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star review and share with family and friends. Thanks.